There are moments that divide a life cleanly into two parts, the before and the after. Most people cannot identify theirs until years later, standing in some ordinary place, doing some ordinary thing, when the memory surfaces without warning and they think, that was it. That was the moment everything changed. Margaret Hale could identify hers precisely. Not the morning she arrived in London, when the city had looked at her through the carriage window, with the blank indifference of something very large that has not yet decided whether to notice you. Not the first evening at Lord Ashton's table, when she had understood within 20 minutes exactly what her position in this household was, and exactly how much it would cost her to maintain it with any dignity. Not even the night she wrote the letter, though that night would come to matter more than almost any other night of her life. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. It was a reading room on the second floor of the Wentworth Club, where the tall windows let in the grey London light, and the smell of old leather and wood smoke, and the particular quality of silence that belongs to rooms full of men who believe they are not being observed. It was her own words in someone else's voice, read aloud to laughter she was never supposed to hear. That was the moment. And what happened in the 60 seconds after that moment, what Margaret Hale did and did not do and chose in the space of one breath and then another, is the reason this story is worth telling at all. But we begin, as all things begin, before any of it. We begin with the letter. The letter almost didn't happen. This is worth saying at the outset, because in the weeks and months that followed, Margaret would return to this fact the way you return to a stone in your shoe, constantly, unavoidably, with a mixture of frustration and something that was almost, but not quite, regret. The letter almost didn't happen. She had written it and sealed it and held the sealed envelope in both hands for 3 days before she sent it. She had argued herself into sending it and argued herself back out of it and then sent it in a moment of decisive stupidity. Her word, her own word, applied to herself without mercy, on a Thursday morning when she was tired and the rain wouldn't stop, and she thought, what is the worst that can happen? She had, it turned out, insufficient imagination. But that was later. Before the letter there was London, and before London there was everything else. Margaret Hale was 24 years old and had been educated well beyond what her circumstances could support, which was the particular cruelty visited upon daughters of men who loved learning more than they loved money. Her father had been a country solicitor in Wiltshire, not poor, not comfortable, somewhere in between, and deeply, entirely absorbed in his books. He had taught Margaret Latin at 7 and Greek at 9, and had handed her Plutarch at 11 with the same matter-of-fact enthusiasm with which other fathers handed their daughters embroidery patterns. He had died when she was 19, leaving her a modest sum, a great many books, and the kind of mind that was genuinely useful in a world that had very little use for it. The sum lasted 4 years, the books she still had, the mind she carried everywhere like luggage no one had offered to help with. Lord Ashton was a second cousin on her mother's side, distant enough that the connection was more theoretical than real, close enough that he had felt some obligation when her circumstances became pressing. He was a decent man, Lord Ashton, not brilliant, not warm, but decent in the solid, unimaginative way of men who have never been required to be otherwise. He had offered her a room in his London house and a place at his table, and a small quarterly sum, framed as a loan that both of them understood would never be repaid, and Margaret had accepted because the alternative was a governess position in Northumberland that she had been trying very hard not to think of as the end of something. London had been instructive. That was the word she used in her letters home to Mrs. Avery, who had been her neighbor in Wiltshire, and who wrote back with the faithful regularity of someone who understood that letters were a lifeline. London is instructive, Margaret wrote. I am learning a great deal about what rooms look like from the outside, and rather less about what they look like from the inside, but I am told this improves with time. It had not, in 6 months, noticeably improved. She knew her position. She was not a servant, she had her own room, she sat at table. She was introduced at gatherings as Lord Ashton's cousin, which was technically accurate and contextually misleading. But she was not family either, not really, not in the way that family moves through a house, freely, proprietorially, as if the walls belonged to them. She moved through Lord Ashton's house carefully, taking up as little space as possible, making herself useful in ways that didn't require being asked, anticipating needs before they became requests, because anticipation felt like agency and requests felt like something else entirely. She read. She always read. Lord Ashton's library was good, better than she'd expected, and she worked through it with the focused pleasure of someone given access to something they had been hungry for. She wrote her letters to Mrs. Avery. She attended the gatherings and the dinners and the afternoons that constituted the social machinery of this particular corner of London, and she sat where she was placed and said what was appropriate and watched everything with the quiet, recording attention that had been her primary way of being in the world since she was 11 years old and her mother died, and she had understood, without being told, that she would need to be very good at understanding things. She was good at it. She was very good at it. It simply wasn't, in this world, considered a useful quality in a woman. She met the Duke of Wentworth at Lord Farthington's dinner in April. This is worth saying plainly because the meeting itself was entirely unimpressive, which is often how the important ones go. No thunderclap. No significant exchange. He arrived late. She registered this because late arrivals always momentarily reorganized the room, and she had learned to track reorganizations. And he was tall and dark, and the room did its thing around him. The slight collective adjustment, the subtle reorientation, and Margaret noted this and noted him and returned to her soup. He was seated 4 places from her at a long table. He spoke to the woman on his left and the man on his right and did not speak to Margaret at all. She did not speak to him. After dinner, the party divided in the customary way, men to the library, women to the drawing room, and that was the end of it. She thought, going home in Lord Ashton's carriage, that the Duke of Wentworth was exactly what she had been told he was: formidably intelligent, formidably private, the kind of man who wears authority the way other men wear coats, so naturally, and for so long that they have forgotten it is something they put on. She thought she would probably not speak to him. She was wrong, as it happened, but not for another 3 weeks. The second meeting was at Lady Pemberton's literary afternoon, one of those semi-regular gatherings where books were theoretically discussed and actually used as props for social performances of varying sophistication. Margaret had been looking forward to it in the private, careful way she allowed herself to look forward to things that might disappoint her, which was to say, moderately, with significant reservations. The Duke was there. This surprised her. He did not seem like a man who attended literary afternoons. He was standing near the bookshelves when she arrived, holding a volume with the focused attention of someone actually reading rather than performing reading, which was unusual enough in that room that she noticed it immediately. She found her seat. She accepted her tea. The afternoon began. Lady Pemberton introduced the evening's text, a recently published essay on the nature of memory and its relationship to language, which was more interesting than the usual fare, and which Margaret had already read twice. Discussion opened. People said the things people said at these gatherings, appreciative but non-committal, the conversational equivalent of a curtsy. And then the Duke, without looking up from his own copy, said, "The central argument doesn't hold. He's confusing the record of a thing with the thing itself. Memory isn't language. Language is what we use when memory fails us." The room paused. Margaret, before she had decided to, said, "Or language is what we use to give memory a shape it can survive in. The record isn't the thing, but without the record the thing dissolves." A longer pause. The Duke looked up. He looked at her directly, without the social preamble of finding someone in a room and deciding whether they merit attention. Just looked, as if he had heard something that required the source to be identified. That assumes, he said, that survival is the point. Isn't it usually, Margaret said. For the memory, perhaps, not always for the person carrying it. Margaret looked at him. He looked back. Around them, the room made its small sounds of recalibration, the slight social shuffling of people who have witnessed something they weren't expecting and haven't yet decided what it means. Lady Pemberton smoothly redirected the conversation. But for the rest of the afternoon, when the discussion moved and turned and doubled back on itself, the Duke's contributions and Margaret's had a way of finding each other across the room, not always agreeing, not always at length, but with the particular quality of two people who have identified something in the other that they don't often find and are being, both of them, somewhat careful about what to do with it. Going home in the carriage, Lord Ashton said, "Wentworth seemed interested in what you had to say." "We disagreed on several points," Margaret said. "Yes," said Lord Ashton, and looked out the window and said nothing else. The weeks that followed had a shape that Margaret recognized in retrospect as the shape of something growing, slowly, carefully, in the particular way of things that grow in uncertain soil. The same gatherings, the same rooms, but with a different texture now, a different quality of attention. The Duke sought her out. Not obviously, not in the way that would have set rooms talking and Lady Pembridge warning and the whole social machinery grinding into anxious motion. Quietly. A conversation at the edge of a dinner party here, an exchange of views on a recently published pamphlet there. He asked her opinion on things and then actually waited for the answer, which she was finding was considerably rarer than it should have been. He disagreed with her often, directly, without softening, and she found this more respectful than agreement would have been. She was careful. She knew what she was and what he was and the considerable distance between those two things. She watched herself with the same attention she watched everything else, looking for the signs of foolishness she had promised herself she would not indulge in. She was 24 years old and she was not romantic and she was not naive, and she understood perfectly well that interest was not intention and attention was not promise. She was careful. And then he left for 3 weeks. An estate matter in the north, Lord Ashton said, something requiring his direct attention, and the rooms they had both been occupying went back to their normal texture. And Margaret sat in Lord Ashton's library one evening with a book she couldn't concentrate on and thought about a conversation they'd had the previous Tuesday about whether it was possible to truly know a place you hadn't grown up in, and what he'd said about his own estate. "I know everything about it and understand nothing of it, which is a strange way to love something," and before she had quite decided to, she was at the writing desk. She wrote for an hour. Not about feelings, not about him specifically, not in any way that named what she was beginning, reluctantly and with considerable resistance, to understand about herself. She wrote about the conversation, about the question of knowing versus understanding, about her own experience of London, about a passage in a book she'd been reading that seemed to her to address exactly what he'd been reaching for without quite finding. She wrote the way she thought, which was directly and without performance, following the idea wherever it went and trusting the reader to follow. She wrote for an hour and then she read it back and thought, "This is either very good or very stupid, and I cannot tell which." She sealed it before she could decide. She addressed it to the Duke of Wentworth, care of Lord Ashton's forwarding arrangements, and she put it on the hall table and went to bed. She lay awake for 2 hours. In the morning the letter was still on the hall table. She picked it up and put it in her pocket and carried it around for 3 days, taking it out and looking at it and putting it back. On Thursday morning it was raining and she was tired, and she stood in the entrance hall in her coat with the letter in her hand and thought, "What is the worst that can happen?" She gave it to the footman to post. She went upstairs. She did not think about it again, or rather, she thought about it constantly, in the way you think about something you have decided not to think about, which is to say it was always there, underneath everything else, a low, persistent note she had agreed with herself to ignore. 3 weeks passed. No reply came. She told herself this was fine, expected even. He was a duke and she was Lord Ashton's distant cousin in a borrowed room, and she had sent him an unsolicited letter about epistemology and the nature of knowing, which was, she could see this clearly in retrospect, an unusual thing to do. He was busy. He had an estate. He had, presumably, rather a lot of correspondence that took precedence over letters from women he had spoken to at a handful of gatherings, and who had taken leave of their senses on a rainy Thursday. She told herself all of this and believed most of it. And then Lord Ashton announced, one morning over breakfast, that he would be visiting the Wentworth Club that Tuesday. The new reading room had recently opened its doors to female guests, accompanied, on Tuesday afternoons, a progressive gesture that had been discussed extensively in the papers, and that Lord Ashton thought Margaret might find interesting. Margaret said she would be glad to come. She said it calmly. She meant it calmly. It was a reading room, and she liked reading rooms, and the fact that it was the Wentworth Club had nothing whatsoever to do with anything. On Tuesday afternoon, she put on her good dress, the deep green one that Mrs. Avery had always said suited her, and she went. Edward Wentworth received the letter on a Wednesday. He had been at Wentworth Park for 11 days by then, 11 days of tenant meetings and drainage disputes, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from the sustained performance of being the person everyone in a room is waiting for. His steward was competent. His tenants were, on the whole, reasonable. The estate ran itself adequately and had done so for years. But there were decisions that required him, signatures, judgments, the specific weight of his name on specific documents. And so he came, twice a year, and did what was required, and then returned to London feeling simultaneously necessary and hollow. The post arrived in the morning, sorted by his secretary into the usual categories: estate business, parliamentary correspondence, personal letters, things that could wait. He worked through them in order, standing at his desk the way he worked through most things, efficiently and without ceremony. The letter from London was in the personal pile near the bottom. He almost left it for the evening. He had 3 more tenant meetings before noon and a fence dispute in the North Field that his steward had been unable to resolve, and that apparently required Edward's physical presence to confirm that yes, the fence was in the wrong place, and yes, it needed to be moved, and yes, he was certain. He almost left the letter. He didn't. He picked it up because the handwriting was unfamiliar. Not his mother, not Charlotte, not any of the half-dozen people whose personal correspondence he received with any regularity. Small and precise, the letters formed with the particular neatness of someone who had been taught to write carefully, and had then developed, over years of practice, a style that was neat without being rigid. He broke the seal. He read it once quickly, the way he read everything first, scanning for structure, for the shape of the argument, for what the thing was actually about beneath what it appeared to be about. Then he stood very still for a moment. Then he read it again, slowly this time. The letter was about a conversation they had had, the one at Lady Pemberton's, 3 weeks ago, about knowing versus understanding. She had been thinking about it, she said, not because she disagreed with what he'd said, or not entirely, but because she thought he had been reaching for something that the conversation hadn't quite given him room to reach. And then she had found a passage in a book, and she quoted it, and explained what she thought it meant, and then she said what she thought about all of it directly and without apology, following the idea wherever it went, trusting him to follow. It was one of the finest letters he had ever received. He was aware, as he stood at his desk with the morning light coming through the estate office window, that this was not a small thing to think. He received a great deal of correspondence. He had been educated at institutions that believed in the primacy of written argument, and had spent 36 years in the company of men who prided themselves on the quality of their written expression. He knew what good thinking looked like on a page. He knew the difference between intelligence performed and intelligence actually at work. This was the second kind. He put the letter down. He picked it up. He read the last paragraph again, the one that had made him go still the first time and made him go still again now. Not because of what it said about the book or about the question they had been discussing. Because of what it said underneath that, the thing she hadn't named but that was present in every sentence, in the particular quality of attention she had brought to this, in the fact that she had written it at all. He put the letter in his inside coat pocket. He went to his tenant meetings. The fence was in the wrong place. He confirmed this. He signed the necessary documents. He ate lunch with his steward and discussed the drainage situation in the North Field and made 3 decisions that he would not remember making by the following week. He thought about the letter. Not about what to say in response. He would get to that. He would think about that properly when he had time to think properly, when he was back in London and had the leisure to sit and compose something that was, but about the letter itself, about the fact of it. About a woman who had sat in her cousin's borrowed room on a rainy afternoon and written him 5 pages about an idea because she had been thinking about it and had trusted him to find that worth receiving. He had not been trusted like that he couldn't remember. In a very long time, he told himself he would write back that evening. That evening he had dinner with his estate manager and 2 of his longer-standing tenants, a working dinner that ran until 11. And by the time it was finished, he was tired in the hollow way the estate always made him tired, and he told himself he would write in the morning, when he was sharper, when the response would be better for the wait. In the morning there were more meetings. He told himself again that he would write that evening, and then the following morning, and then the day after. He did not examine too carefully why he kept not writing. He was a man who had learned, over 36 years, that there were certain rooms inside himself that were better left unlit. He had learned this the way you learn most important things, through the specific pain of what happens when you light them. On the 5th day, he received a letter from his friend Bertram Alcott, who was in London and bored and wanted to know when Edward was returning because the club was dull without him, and there was a vote in the Lords next week that Edward would want to weigh in on. Edward wrote back the same day, promptly, efficiently, a full page. He noted, distantly and without fully looking at the noting, that he had written to Bertram immediately and had not written to Margaret Hale at all. He put this observation in the unlit room and closed the door. He returned to London on a Sunday. Monday he spent on parliamentary business. Tuesday he was at the club by noon. Bertram was already there, in his customary chair by the fire, with his customary glass and his customary air of a man who has found the precise level of comfort he intends to maintain indefinitely. "You look terrible," Bertram said pleasantly. "You look exactly the same as always," Edward said, which was true, and sat down. They talked. This was what they did here. The easy, ranging conversation of men who had known each other for 20 years and had long since stopped performing for each other. Politics, the estate situation, a mutual friend's increasingly complicated romantic entanglement, the new reading room, which Bertram found progressive and Edward found overdue, and which they debated for 20 minutes with the relaxed enjoyment of an argument neither of them needed to win. Then Bertram said, "Letter in your pocket." Edward looked at him. "You've touched it 3 times since you sat down," Bertram said. "Coat pocket, left side. Whatever it is, it's bothering you." Edward looked at the fire. After a moment, he took the letter out. He should not have done it. He knew, even as he unfolded it, that he should not have done it, not here, not like this, not in this room with Bertram watching and the club settling into its afternoon rhythms around them. There are things that belong in private and things that can be shared, and he knew which category this was. He had known it from the moment he first read it. He read a passage aloud anyway. He told himself later that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, that it was the relief of sharing something that had been sitting in his chest for 2 weeks, pressing. That Bertram was his oldest friend and would understand the context, that he had not meant to make it a performance, had not meant the slight shift in his voice, the slight comic emphasis that made Bertram raise his eyebrows and then laugh, the short surprised laugh of a man who has been given something unexpected. "Good God," Bertram said, "who is that?" "Ashton's cousin," Edward said. "Miss Hale, she's been in London 6 months. Ashton's the quiet one, dark hair, always reading." "Yes." Bertram looked at the letter with an expression that mixed amusement and something more complicated. "She writes like this." "She thinks like this," Edward said, and heard, as he said it, the particular quality in his own voice, something warmer than he had intended, something that gave more away than he meant to give, and stopped. Bertram heard it too. He looked at Edward for a moment, with the attention of a man who has known someone for 20 years and does not miss much. "Have you written back?" Bertram said, a pause. "Not yet," Edward said. Bertram said nothing. He looked at the fire. He was quiet for long enough that the silence became a thing in itself, not comfortable, the way their silences usually were, but pointed, the way silences become when someone is deciding whether to say the thing they are thinking. He did not say it. Instead, he reached out and took the letter gently, briefly, and read another passage. And then, before Edward could reconsider the entire situation, Ashton's friend Lord Finch appeared in the doorway of the reading room, fresh from somewhere, in the mood for company, and settled into the third chair with the cheerful presumption of a man who has never been unwelcome anywhere and does not intend to start now. "What's that?" Finch said, nodding at the letter. "Nothing," Edward said, and took it back and folded it. But Finch had already read 2 lines over Bertram's shoulder, and Finch, Edward knew this, had always known this. It was simply a fact about Finch the way the color of his eyes was a fact, was a man who collected information the way other men collected silver. Quietly, persistently, with an eye to its eventual usefulness. Finch smiled pleasantly and asked about the vote in the Lords. The conversation moved on. Edward put the letter back in his pocket. He told himself it was fine. He told himself Finch had seen 2 lines, nothing more. He told himself he would write the response that evening, properly this time, really, and that would be the end of the discomfort that had been sitting in his chest since Wednesday. He told himself all of this. He did not write the response that evening. The following Tuesday, Lord Finch was in the reading room when Edward arrived. This was not unusual. Finch was often at the club. What was unusual was the small group around him, and the particular quality of attention in the room, and the fact that Finch was holding something that Edward recognized from across the room before he was close enough to see it clearly. He recognized the handwriting first. Small and precise, neat without being rigid. "And I think this is what you were reaching for, though perhaps you didn't have the words for it yet, which is not a criticism, only an observation that some ideas arrive before their language does, and the waiting is not wasted time." Finch's voice. Margaret's words. Edward stopped walking. The men around Finch were listening with the expressions of men being entertained, not cruelly, not with any particular malice, the way an audience is entertained by something unexpected and slightly absurd. Someone laughed, a short laugh, more surprised than unkind. Edward stood very still. And then he heard, from somewhere behind him and to his left, the quality of the room change. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a shift, a slight holding of breath, the way rooms shift when something has happened that cannot be unhappened. He turned. Margaret Hale was standing 6 feet behind him. She was in a dark green dress he had not seen before, and she was standing very straight, and her face was, he would think about her face for a long time afterward, trying to find the right word for what it was doing. Not devastated, not angry, not in the visible, hot way of anger. Something that had been several things at once and had chosen, in the moment he turned to look at her, to be none of them. Something that had closed itself down with a precision and a speed that told him more about how much practice she'd had at closing things down than it told him about what was underneath. Beside her, Lord Ashton looked as though he had swallowed something very unpleasant. The room was very quiet. Edward looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at him. And then she did something he had not expected. She did not leave. She did not cry or speak or make any of the sounds that the situation seemed to call for. She looked at him for one long, clear, measuring moment. The same look she had given him at Lady Pemberton's, the one that didn't perform, the one that simply looked. And then she turned to Lord Ashton and said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "Is there somewhere to sit?" Lord Ashton blinked. Yes, of course, there are chairs by the—" "Thank you," Margaret said. And she walked to the nearest empty chair, sat down, opened the small book she was carrying and began to read. The room held its breath for another moment. Then slowly it exhaled. Conversations resumed carefully, quietly, with the self-conscious normalcy of people who have witnessed something they are still deciding how to categorize. Finch folded the letter. Edward did not look at what Finch did with it after that. He was looking at Margaret Hale, sitting in a chair by the window of the room that bore his family's name, reading her book with the concentrated stillness of someone who has decided that this, here, now, is where she is, and that the room and everyone in it can make of that whatever they like. He had spent 36 years being the most composed person in any room he entered. He was not, at this moment, the most composed person in this one. She read 4 pages. She knew this precisely because she counted them. Not the words, not the paragraphs, but the pages, turned one by one with the steady deliberateness of a woman who has decided that the next thing she will do is turn a page, and then the next thing after that will be to turn another. And if she continues in this fashion long enough, the afternoon will eventually end, and she will be in a carriage going home, and this will be behind her. Page 1. The words moved past her eyes without leaving anything behind. She retained nothing, not a sentence, not a phrase, not the shape of a single argument. It didn't matter. The point was not the reading. The point was the appearance of the reading, which was the only armor she had available to her in this room on this Tuesday afternoon, and she was going to wear it until she could leave without it looking like flight. Page 2. Around her, the room had resumed itself. She could hear it, the careful, resumed quality of conversations that had been interrupted and were now being deliberately restarted, the specific social effort of men who have witnessed something uncomfortable and are choosing, collectively, to perform normalcy. She was grateful for this. In the distant, detached way she was capable of being grateful for things at the present moment. She did not want to be witnessed. She did not want the room's attention, which had rested on her for approximately 45 seconds after she sat down and had now, mercifully, moved elsewhere. She turned page 3. She was aware of him. She did not look up, had not looked up since she sat down, would not look up, had made this decision with the same clarity with which she had made the decision to sit rather than leave. But she was aware of him the way you are aware of something large and warm in your peripheral vision. He had not moved from where she had last seen him. She could feel the specific quality of his stillness across the room, which was different from the stillness of the other men, less comfortable, more contained, the stillness of someone holding something in rather than someone at rest. Good, she thought, and was immediately ashamed of the thought, and then immediately stopped being ashamed of it because she was allowed, she was entirely allowed. She had earned this one small, mean thought, and she was going to keep it. Page 4. Lord Ashton materialized in the chair beside her, lowering himself into it with the careful movements of a large man trying to be unobtrusive, which he was not succeeding at, but she appreciated the effort. "Margaret," he said very quietly. "I'm nearly finished with this chapter," she said, a pause. "We can leave whenever you—" "I'm nearly finished with this chapter," she said again. Same tone, same volume, not sharp. She didn't have sharp available to her at the present moment, couldn't afford it, but she had steady and she was using every bit of it. Lord Ashton subsided. She turned page 4. What she did not allow herself to think about in those 40 minutes in the reading room. The 40 minutes she stayed, which was long enough to be a choice and not long enough to be a statement, or so she calibrated, was the content of what she had heard. She would think about it later. She would have to think about it later. But not here, not now, not with him 15 feet away and the room half listening, and her only protection being the appearance of a woman who was perfectly fine and reading a book. She had heard her own words. That was the fact of it, the bare fact, and she kept it bare, did not dress it, did not examine it, did not let herself feel the specific quality of what it was to hear your own words coming out of someone else's mouth in a room you were not supposed to be in. She had heard them and she had recognized them, and she had stood very still and let the recognition move through her the way cold water moves through you, fast, total, leaving you knowing exactly what temperature the world is. And then she had sat down. She had sat down because leaving was the thing that would be remembered. Leaving was the image that would carry Margaret Hale, who could not bear it, who fled, who confirmed by her flight that there was something to flee from. She had understood this in the 2 seconds between hearing her words and making her decision, and she had made the decision the way she made most decisions, quickly, clearly, with a full accounting of what it would cost her. It would cost her 40 minutes in a chair. She could pay that. What she could not, would not pay was the alternative. She turned the last page of the chapter. She closed the book. She placed it in her lap. She looked out the window at the gray October London, the wet rooftops, the pigeons, the perfectly ordinary afternoon proceeding outside as if nothing had happened inside, which was, she supposed, accurate. Nothing had happened from the city's perspective. A woman had stood in a room and heard something and sat down. This happened every day in various forms to various women in various rooms. The city didn't notice. The city never noticed. She became aware, by some peripheral sense she couldn't have named, that he was moving. She did not look up. She heard his footsteps, measured, unhurried, the walk of a man who has decided to do something and is doing it at his own pace. She heard them cross the room. She heard them stop. She looked up. He was standing 4 feet from her chair. He was not performing anything, not the social face, not the public composure, not the managed expression she had catalogued over months of watching him in rooms. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. She couldn't name it precisely. It was somewhere in the territory between stripped and afraid, and it was, she noted this, filed it, refused to let it move her yet, the most honest she had ever seen him look. Lord Ashton made a small sound beside her and rose from his chair, suddenly remembering something that required his attention elsewhere in the room. She would thank him for this later, or possibly she would be furious with him for it. She hadn't decided yet. "Miss Hale," the Duke said. His voice was careful, more careful than she had heard it, as if he was placing each word down deliberately, checking the ground before he put his weight on it. Margaret looked at him. She had prepared in the 40 minutes of her chapter for several versions of this moment. She had prepared for an apology, formal, polished, the kind of apology that a man of his position delivers when he has done something that requires an apology and wants the transaction completed efficiently. She had prepared for an explanation, the mitigating circumstances, the context, the reasons that were not excuses but would function as excuses anyway. She had prepared even for nothing, for him to not approach at all, to let the afternoon conclude without acknowledgement, which would have been its own kind of statement. She had not prepared for his face looking like that. "I have no excuse to offer you," he said. "I want to be clear about that at the outset. What I did was," he stopped. She could see him rejecting words, reaching for one, finding it insufficient, setting it down. "It was a betrayal," he said finally, "of your trust and of your words and of," another stop, "of something I should have valued considerably more carefully than I did." Margaret said nothing. "I am sorry," he said. "That is inadequate. I know it's inadequate. But it is what I have to offer you at the moment, and I wanted to offer it before you left." A pause. Margaret looked at him for a long time, the long, unhurried looking that she didn't perform but simply did, when she needed to understand something. She thought about 40 minutes of turned pages. She thought about her own words in someone else's voice. She thought about 3 weeks of silence, the letter sitting in his pocket, presumably, being carried around like a stone he couldn't put down and couldn't throw away, which was its own kind of information, which she was not yet ready to do anything with. She thought about all of this, and then she said, very quietly and very clearly, "You did not write back." He held her gaze. "No." "For 3 weeks." "Yes." And instead of writing back, she said, "You read it aloud." Not. He stopped, started again because whatever the qualification was, he had decided not to make it. "Yes," he said simply. She nodded once. The small, precise nod of someone receiving a confirmation they had already known but needed to hear said plainly. She stood up. He took a half step back, not retreat, more the instinctive movement of a person recalibrating proximity. And she was now standing on the same level as him, which changed the quality of the conversation in some small but significant way. "I am going to leave now," she said. "Not because I cannot bear to be here. I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said quietly. "I am leaving because I have been here long enough." "Yes." She looked at him for one more moment. She thought about the last paragraph of her letter. The one she had almost cut, had rewritten 3 times, had very nearly crossed out entirely before deciding that if she was going to send the thing at all, she was going to send the whole of it. She wondered for the first time whether he had reached it, whether Finch had read that far, whether those words had been in the room before she arrived, or whether they were still, somehow, by some accident of timing, only his. She picked up her book. "Good afternoon, Your Grace," she said. She walked to where Lord Ashton was standing near the door, doing a poor impression of a man examining a bookshelf. They left. In the carriage, Lord Ashton said nothing for a full 5 minutes. This was, Margaret thought, possibly the most considerate thing he had ever done. Then he said, "Margaret, I don't know what to say. I'm deeply sorry." "You didn't know," she said. "I should have when I heard. I should have." "You didn't know," she said again, gently, because he was genuinely distressed and it was not his fault and she had enough to carry without adding his guilt to it. No one could have known. He subsided. The carriage moved through the London streets. It was raining now. Of course it was raining. It had been raining the morning she sent the letter, and it was raining now, as if the city had decided to maintain a consistent meteorological commentary on her decisions. She looked out the window. She let herself. Now that she was alone, or near enough to alone, Lord Ashton had gone somewhere inside himself and was staring at the opposite seat with the expression of a man doing penance. She let herself feel it. Not all of it. Not the full weight of it, not yet. She wasn't ready for that. She would need to be somewhere very private and very quiet for the full weight of it. But some of it. The specific humiliation of it, which was different from ordinary humiliation because it had happened to her words, not to her appearance or her position or her lack of the right connections, but to the thing she had written at 2 in the morning because she was thinking and trusted him to find that worth receiving. Her words in his voice for laughter. And underneath that deeper, quieter, the thing she had least prepared for and found hardest to hold, the 3 weeks of silence. The letter, carried for 3 weeks without reply. The trust extended and not returned, which was its own kind of answer, and she had simply not been reading it. She had not been stupid. She searched for the word and found it hopeful, which was, she supposed, a variety of stupidity, but a more forgivable one. She was not going to be hopeful again, not about this, not about him. She made this decision in the carriage on the way home, clearly and deliberately, in the same way she made all decisions. She looked out at the wet London street. She thought, well, now I know. And she did know. She knew precisely. The question was only what she intended to do with the knowing, which was a different question, and one she was not yet ready to answer. She would need her book. She would need her room. She would need Mrs. Avery's next letter, which was due by Friday, and which would say something practical and affectionate and entirely uncomplicated, which was what she needed most right now. She would need, she thought, a few days. And then she would decide. He stayed at the club for another hour after she left. He did not know why. There was nothing for him there. The reading room had resumed itself. Finch had disappeared. Bertram had not been present for any of it, and therefore could not offer the particular absolution of someone who had witnessed the thing and was willing to discuss it. There was nothing in the club that he needed or wanted. He stayed anyway, in the chair by the fire that was usually Bertram's, and looked at the fire and tried to do something useful with his thoughts and found he couldn't. He kept seeing her face. Not the closed face, not the expression she had assembled after the first moment, the precision-made composure that had held for the entire 40 minutes she had sat in that chair. The moment before that, the 2 seconds, perhaps less, between when she had registered what she was hearing and when she had made her decision about how to carry it. He had seen her face in those 2 seconds. He was not going to describe what he had seen there, even to himself, because describing it would require him to fully understand what he had done, and he was not yet, not in this chair in this club with the fire going and the afternoon going gray outside. He was not ready to fully understand it. He understood enough. He understood that he had taken something private and made it public. He understood that he had done it without meaning to cause harm, and that this did not, in any meaningful sense, reduce the harm. He understood that the 3 weeks of silence which had felt, from the inside, like a reasonable delay, a temporary postponement of something he wasn't ready to address, had been, from the outside, something considerably colder and more final. He understood that he had carried her letter for 3 weeks and written back to Bertram the same day Bertram wrote to him, and that this was a fact about him that he did not like. He thought about what Lord Cavendish had said to him 6 months ago about Celia. You withdrew, Cavendish had said, in the direct way of old men who have decided they have earned the right to directness. You always withdraw. It is your primary talent and your primary failing, and one of these days it will cost you something you actually wanted to keep. Edward had said, Thank you, Cavendish. Cavendish had said, I'm not finished. The withdrawing is survivable. The not knowing you're doing it is the problem. Edward had said, I appreciate the observation. Cavendish had looked at him with the expression of a man who knows he is talking to a wall and is going to talk to it anyway, because someone should. Then he had gone back to his port and the conversation had ended. Edward sat in Bertram's chair and thought about withdrawing. He thought about the letter carried for 3 weeks, never answered. He thought about the specific quality of her voice when she had said, You did not write back. Not accusing, she had stated it the way she stated things, plainly and directly, as a fact that required acknowledgement rather than a wound that required dressing. He had respected this, and found it harder to bear than accusation would have been. He thought about the last paragraph of her letter. He had not read it aloud. This was not an accident. He had reached it and stopped, folded the letter, put it back in his pocket while Finch was settling into his chair and Bertram was looking at him with those 20 years of knowing eyes. He had stopped because the last paragraph was, it was different from the rest. The rest of the letter was about ideas, about the conversation, about a book and a question and what she thought about them. The last paragraph was about something else. It was about him, specifically, carefully, in a way that would have told everyone in the room something he had not yet decided what to do with himself. He had not read it aloud. He was not sure whether this made things better or worse. It made them different. There was some part of what she had trusted him with that remained, by his choice, private. He wasn't sure he deserved credit for this. He had read everything else. He stayed until the fire burned lower. Then he went home. He sat at his desk. He took out a piece of paper. He wrote, Miss Hale, and then he stopped, because everything that came after those 2 words was either insufficient or too much, and he couldn't find the line between them. He sat for a long time. He wrote, I owe you an explanation. I am not certain I have one that is adequate, but I owe you an attempt." He looked at this. He wrote 3 more lines and then crossed them out. He wrote, "You asked why I did not write back. The honest answer is that I did not know what to do with your letter, and I handled not knowing by doing nothing, which is the thing I do, apparently, when something matters enough to frighten me. I am aware this is not a satisfying answer. I am not certain I have a better one." He stopped. He read this back. He thought, "This is either the most honest thing I have written in 36 years, or it is a mistake of considerable proportions." He folded it. He would decide in the morning whether to send it. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a very long time. He sent the letter in the morning. Not because he had decided, overnight, that it was the right thing to do. He had not slept well enough to decide anything with confidence. He sent it because he woke at 6 with the particular clarity of a man who has run out of postponements, who has looked at the available options and found that all of them require something of him, and that the one requiring the most honest thing is also, perhaps, the one he can live with, and he got up and reread what he had written and thought. "This is insufficient, and it is true, and it is what I have." He gave it to his man before he could reconsider the phrasing. Then he went about his day. Parliamentary business in the morning. A committee meeting on agricultural reform that required his attention and received approximately half of it, the other half being occupied with a question he kept returning to without meaning to: whether she had received the letter, and whether she had read it, and what her face had done when she did. He had no way of knowing any of this. This was, he recognized, the precise and deserved consequence of being a man who had spent 36 years arranging his life, so that he always knew the relevant information before he needed it. He was competent at this. He had systems, people who told him things, structures that kept him informed, the accumulated intelligence of a title, and a social position that meant very little that mattered happened near him without his eventually knowing of it. He was not accustomed to the specific discomfort of having done something and then having to wait, without recourse, to understand its effects. He did not like it. He attended the committee meeting. He said the correct things. He voted on a procedural matter and left at noon and went to his club, because he had nowhere better to be and because the alternative was his own house, which was very large and very quiet in the particular way of houses that have been well maintained but not much lived in. Lord Cavendish was in his customary chair. Cavendish was 73 and had been a member of the Wentworth Club longer than Edward had been alive, which was one of several reasons Edward had always found him worth listening to. He was reading a newspaper with the complete absorption of a man who has reduced his life to its essential pleasures and intends to enjoy them without interruption. He looked up when Edward sat across from him. He looked at Edward for a moment. "Sit down," he said, though Edward was already sitting. It was the kind of thing Cavendish said, the instruction that arrived slightly after the fact, asserting authority over something that had already happened, because Cavendish had been asserting authority for 73 years and had no intention of stopping on account of timing. "I heard about Tuesday," Cavendish said. Edward said nothing. "Finch told me." Cavendish folded his newspaper with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who has done everything unhurriedly for so long that haste has become literally inconceivable to him. He seemed to think it was amusing. I disabused him of this impression. "Thank you," Edward said. "I didn't do it for you," Cavendish said. "I did it because Finch is an idiot and I find his idiocy in small doses correctable." He looked at Edward steadily. "The woman wrote you a letter." "Yes." "A serious letter, about ideas." "Yes." "And you carried it for 3 weeks, during which time you did not respond, and then you read portions of it aloud in a room full of men." Cavendish paused. "Have I understood the situation correctly?" "Yes," Edward said. Cavendish looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man assembling a verdict. "That woman," he said finally, "is considerably smarter than you," Edward said. "I am aware." I don't mean in the general sense, though that may also be true. I mean specifically, in this situation, she has behaved with more intelligence and more dignity than you have managed, and you are a man who prides himself on both. Another pause. She sat down. Yes. When most women would have left, when leaving would have been entirely understandable, entirely forgivable, she sat down and she read her book. Cavendish picked up his newspaper again, a gesture that indicated the primary portion of the conversation was concluding. That is not weakness. That is a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and why she is doing it. He looked at Edward over the top of the paper. The question is whether you know what you are doing. Which, based on available evidence, is less clear. Edward looked at the fire. I sent her a letter this morning, he said. Cavendish lowered the newspaper a fraction. Apologizing, Edward said, and explaining as much as I could explain. A pause. Was it honest? Cavendish said. More honest than comfortable. Cavendish raised the newspaper again. Good, he said, that's the right direction. He turned a page. Now leave me alone, I'm reading. Edward left him alone. He went home. The reply came 2 days later. 2 days during which he went about his life with the surface competence of a man who has a great deal of practice at surface competence, and during which he checked, twice, whether the post had arrived, and found himself standing in his entrance hall looking at letters addressed to him, with the specific focused attention of a man who is looking for one letter in particular, and is trying not to look like he is looking. He found it on Thursday morning, plain seal, plain paper, the handwriting he recognized before he picked it up. He took it to his study. He read it standing, as he read everything, but he did not read it fast. She had not written much, half a page less, but it was the particular quality of the half page that mattered. She had read his letter, she said. She appreciated the honesty of it, which was different, she said, from appreciating the letter itself, and she wanted him to understand the difference. She was not certain what she wanted to say in response. She was not certain, she said, that she had anything to say at the present moment that would be useful to either of them. She needed time to think, and she intended to take it, and she would not pretend otherwise. She did not say that she forgave him. She did not say that she did not. Said, I'm not in the habit of making decisions while angry. I find anger clarifying in some ways and distorting in others, and I prefer to wait until I can tell the difference. When I can, I will write again. I hope you will extend me the same courtesy you failed to extend before, which is to say, patience, and the basic assumption that what I have to say is worth waiting for. Then, M.H. Edward read this 3 times. Then he sat down, which he almost never did when reading correspondence. He thought about the same courtesy you failed to extend before. He thought about the precision of it, not cruel, not overwrought, simply accurate. The word failed placed exactly where it needed to be, doing exactly the work it needed to do, without apology or softening because it didn't require any. He thought, she is extraordinarily good with language. He thought, she trusted me with that, and I read it aloud to Finch. He put the letter in the drawer of his desk, the private drawer, the one his secretary never opened, and went back to his day. He would wait. He was not good at waiting. He knew this about himself. It was one of the things he knew clearly and had never successfully changed, the impatience that lived underneath the composed surface, the need to resolve things, close things, move forward to the next item. He was not good at leaving things open. He was going to wait anyway. He owed her that much. He owed her considerably more than that, but patience was what she had asked for, and it was what he had to give her, and so he would give it fully, genuinely, for however long it took. He went about his life. He did not check the post with any unusual frequency. He was, he told himself, managing this well. He was not, Bertram told him the following Tuesday, managing it well at all. Bertram had heard, of course. Bertram always heard, not from Finch, he said, with a distaste that suggested Finch had tried and been rebuffed, but from Alcott Sr., who had been in the reading room and whose version of events, Bertram implied, had been rather more favorable to Edward than the version Finch was circulating. They were at the club, the reading room. Edward had not been back since Tuesday and was back now partly because avoiding it felt like the kind of thing that would compound the original error, and partly because, he admitted this at least to himself, he was hoping, distantly and without allowing the hope to become expectation, that she might be here. She was not here. "She's not coming," Bertram said, reading him with the infuriating accuracy of 20 years. "Not yet, possibly not for a while." "I'm not," Edward began. "You're looking at the door," Bertram said. "You've looked at it 4 times since we sat down. It's been 11 minutes. Edward looked at the fire instead. "Tell me what happened," Bertram said. Not the social version, he had heard the social version. He meant the real one. So Edward told him. All of it, the letter arriving at the estate, the reading of it, the 3 weeks of carrying it without reply, the Tuesday, her face, the 40 minutes she had spent in the chair, what she had said when he approached her, what he had said, how she had left. He told it plainly and without the mitigations he might have offered a less familiar audience, because Bertram would have seen through the mitigations, and the effort of constructing them would have been exhausting. Bertram listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Bertram. When Edward finished, Bertram was quiet for a moment. "The last paragraph," he said, "you didn't read it." "No." "Why not?" Edward looked at the fire. Because it was hers, specifically, not the kind of thing he stopped. "Not the kind of thing you read aloud," Bertram said. No, another silence. "What did it say?" Bertram said. "That's not." "I'm not asking out of curiosity," Bertram said, with a patience that was slightly pointed. "I'm asking because I think it matters. I think whatever she wrote in that last paragraph is the part of this you haven't dealt with yet, and I think that's why you're sitting here looking at the door every 3 minutes. Edward looked at the fire for a long time. "She said," he began, and then stopped and then started again because Bertram was right and he was tired of the unlit rooms. "She said that she thought that there was something in the way I engaged with ideas that she hadn't encountered before, that I seemed to her like someone who was genuinely looking for things, rather than confirming what he already knew. And she said," he stopped again, pressed on. "She said she wasn't sure what to do with that. Because it was easier," she said, "to be around people who weren't looking for anything. People who were looking for things had a way of making you want to look too. And she wasn't sure," she said, "whether that was something she could afford." He stopped. The fire made its small sounds. "She wrote that to you," Bertram said, quietly, not a question. "Yes." "And you carried it for 3 weeks." "Yes." "And then you read the rest of it to Finch." "Yes," Edward said. The word landing the way it landed every time he said it, flat and unmitigated and exactly what it was. Bertram was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "for someone who is genuinely looking for things, you are remarkably good at not seeing what's directly in front of you." Edward said nothing. "She told you in that letter exactly what you are to her," Bertram said, "and what she is afraid of, and what it would cost her. And instead of responding, which would have required you to say something honest about what she is to you, which is clearly terrifying, you carried it around for 3 weeks and then read the safe parts to Finch." He paused. "That's not distance, Edward. That's not withdrawing. He searched for the word. "That's cowardice. And I say that as someone who has known you for 20 years and is aware you are generally not a coward." The word settled in the room. Edward did not argue with it. "I know," he said. "Right," Bertram said. He picked up his glass. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Edward looked at the door, then he looked at the fire. Then he looked at Bertram, who was watching him with the expression of a man who already knows the answer and is waiting for the other person to catch up. "Wait," Edward said. "She asked me to wait." "And after the waiting?" "After the waiting," Edward said, "I am going to tell her what the last paragraph made me feel, clearly, in person, without postponing it or carrying it around or finding reasons not to." Bertram nodded slowly. "And what did it make you feel?" he said. Edward looked at the fire one more time. "Like someone had opened a window," he said, "in a room I had been living in for a very long time, and like I had two choices: close it, because open windows let in cold air and require maintenance and change the temperature of everything, or leave it open and see what comes in." A silence. "And," Bertram said. "And I'm tired," Edward said quietly, "of living in closed rooms." Bertram looked at him for a moment. Then he raised his glass. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Edward looked at the fire and thought about waiting, and about open windows, and about a woman who had sat in a chair for 40 minutes with a book she wasn't reading and had left without running. He thought, she is still here. She is in this city. She has not gone anywhere. He thought, I will wait, and then I will not waste what comes after the waiting. He picked up his own glass. Outside, London went about its business in the gray October afternoon, entirely indifferent to any of it. Inside, the fire burned. She did not go to the reading room on Tuesday. She went on Wednesday instead, alone, without Lord Ashton, through the front entrance, with her name given to the doorman and her membership confirmed, because she had, on Monday morning, become a member. This had required a letter to the committee and Lord Ashton's endorsement, and the payment of an annual fee that was not insignificant, and that she paid from the quarterly sum she had been carefully not spending, telling herself she was saving it without ever quite deciding what for. She had decided what for. She was not going to be escorted into rooms. She was not going to enter places as someone else's companion, someone else's guest, someone else's +1 on an invitation. She was going to enter this room, specifically on her own terms, through the front door as a member, because she had every right to be here, and she was going to exercise that right consistently and without apology until it stopped feeling like a statement and started feeling like a Tuesday. Or a Wednesday, as the case may be. She found the chair by the window, her chair, she had decided, which was perhaps an overstatement given that she had sat in it precisely once, but which she intended to make accurate through repetition. She sat. She opened her book. She read. She read actually this time, genuinely, properly, the words going in and staying and building into meaning. She had not been able to read properly for 5 days, which was how she measured the cost of things. In days of not reading, because reading was the most reliable indicator she had of her own internal weather. When she could read, she was all right. When she couldn't, she wasn't. She was today all right. Not fine, fine was further away. Fine required more than 5 days and 1 Wednesday in a reading room. But all right, functional, in possession of herself, which was what mattered most. She had read his letter 4 times. She had made herself wait 24 hours before reading it, because she had meant what she said about anger being distorting, and she had been angry, was still angry, would be angry for some time yet, had made her peace with this, and she wanted to read it with as clear a head as she could manage. So she had waited. She had written to Mrs. Avery. She had helped Lord Ashton with some correspondence that needed no help, and that she offered to help with anyway, because being useful grounded her. She had slept badly and woken up and read his letter. It was honest. This was the thing she kept returning to, with the suspicious attention of someone checking a gift for hidden costs. It was honest. Not polished. Not the kind of letter a man of his position might have produced if he had been trying to produce an impressive apology. It was uneven, slightly halting, reaching for words and not always finding the right ones, which was unusual enough in his writing that it told her something real. He had not performed this. He had written it the way she had written hers, following the thing wherever it went and trusting the reader to follow. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She read for 2 hours. She drank the tea that was brought without her asking for it. The reading room staff had apparently noted her preference from the previous visit, which pleased her in a small, quiet way. She turned pages. She thought about things and let the thinking be what it was, not conclusions, not decisions, just the movement of a mind through a problem it was not yet ready to solve. At 3:30 the door opened. She did not look up. She heard the footsteps. She recognized them with a specificity that she found mildly alarming and filed away to examine at a later date, and she turned a page and kept her eyes on it and waited. The footsteps stopped some distance away. She heard a chair. Silence. She read her page. She turned to the next one. 5 minutes passed. 10. The room held its Tuesday, Wednesday atmosphere around them, the fire, the light, the other members occupying their own chairs and their own silences. He did not approach her. She had half expected him to, had half prepared for it, had her response assembled more or less, a measured acknowledgement that would neither invite nor dismiss. She had it ready. He did not use it. He sat across the room and read his own book and left her entirely, completely, respectfully alone. At 4 o'clock she closed her book. She gathered her things, she stood. She looked across the room. He was looking at her, not performing anything, just looking. With the directness she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he was paying attention to, stripped of the social management that covered everything else. When their eyes met, he did not look away, and he did not speak, and he did not do anything except hold her gaze with an expression she was beginning to be able to read. He was waiting. She looked at him for a moment. Then she gave him the smallest nod, precise, minimal, barely anything at all, and yet something. An acknowledgement, a receipt. Not forgiveness, not yet, not close to yet, but not nothing either. She left. On the street outside, in the gray October air, she stood for a moment and breathed. Then she went home. She sat at her desk. She took out paper. She wrote to Mrs. Avery, "He is waiting. I did not expect him to be patient. I don't know yet what to do with patience in this particular person. It is new information and I am still accounting for it. I will write more when I know more. Your Margaret." She sealed it. She went to bed. She slept for the first time in 5 days without difficulty. October became November the way London seasons changed, not with any particular drama, but with an accumulation of small evidences that added up, eventually, to a different month. The light shifted. The air acquired an edge. The fires in Lord Ashton's house were lit earlier each evening, and the sound of rain on the windows changed character from the percussive rain of autumn to the steady, gray, purposeful rain of a city settling in for the long work of winter. Margaret noticed these things the way she noticed everything, carefully, at a slight remove, filing them alongside everything else. She went to the reading room on Wednesdays. This had become, without either of them formally establishing it, a fact. She arrived at 2:30. She sat in the chair by the window. She read. He arrived sometimes before her, sometimes after, and sat across the room and also read, and they occupied the same space for approximately 90 minutes each week with the careful, considered distance of two people who have come to an unspoken agreement about what the distance means and are, for the present, honoring it. They did not speak. Not because they were avoiding it, or not only because of that, but because the silence had become, in some way she hadn't anticipated, its own kind of conversation. It had a quality to it, their Wednesday silence, that was different from the silence of strangers and different from the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who have too much to say and are taking their time about it, which felt, to Margaret, more respectful than premature words would have been. She was still angry. She was also, she admitted to herself on the third Wednesday, something else. She hadn't named it yet. She was not ready to name it. But it was there, underneath the anger, coexisting with it in the complicated way that feelings coexist when you are honest enough to acknowledge all of them. A warmth she was keeping at a careful distance, like a fire you appreciate but don't stand too close to. She had told Mrs. Avery about the Wednesdays. Mrs. Avery had written back. This sounds, Margaret, like two very stubborn people being very careful with each other, which is either very sensible or very slow, depending on what you want to happen. What do you want to happen? Margaret had read this 3 times, and not answered it and written about something else entirely. She knew what she wanted to happen. She simply wasn't certain yet whether what she wanted was something she could afford. Lord Finch arrived at the reading room, on the second Wednesday of November. She saw him before he saw her, registered him in the doorway with the quick, cataloging attention she gave to everyone who entered a room, assigning him immediately and accurately to the category she had placed him in since the day she understood who had been holding her letter. She returned to her book. He found her anyway. He was good at finding people. She had observed this, in the week since Tuesday, watching him move through the social rooms of their shared circuit. He had a talent for arriving at elbows, for appearing in doorways, for materializing beside chairs in the particular way of men who have learned that information lives in proximity, and have built their entire social existence around being proximate to the right people at the right moments. "Miss Hale," he said, settling into the chair beside her with an ease that assumed welcome. "What a pleasant coincidence." Margaret looked at him. He was handsome in the superficial way of men who have always been handsome and have learned to rely on it. Good features arranged pleasantly, an easy smile, the relaxed confidence of someone who has never walked into a room and wondered whether he was wanted there. She supposed some people found this charming. She found it, at the present moment, approximately as charming as a very well-made trap. "Lord Finch," she said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," she said pleasantly, "but please go on." A flicker of something, surprise, recalibration, and then the smile again, slightly adjusted. He was adaptable, she noted. That was worth knowing. "I wanted to say," he began in the tone of a man who has prepared an opening but is pretending he hasn't, "that I owe you an apology for my part in what happened 2 weeks ago." Margaret looked at him steadily. "I was not kind," he said. "I should have, when Edward began reading, I should have redirected the conversation. I did not, and I am sorry for it." She considered this. It was, she thought, a well-constructed apology. It acknowledged a specific failing, expressed regret, and stopped there, no mitigations, no explanations that functioned as excuses, no requests for absolution. It was also, she thought, not quite the whole truth. He had not merely failed to redirect. He had held the letter. He had read from it. He had done both of these things with the cheerful enthusiasm of a man who has been given an entertaining toy. But she was not, at the present moment, interested in prosecuting Lord Finch. She was interested in understanding him, which was a different project. "I appreciate you saying so," she said. "You're very gracious." "I'm not particularly," she said. "I'm practical. Gracious and practical look similar from the outside." Another flicker, another recalibration, and then something very briefly, very quickly, there and gone, that might have been genuine amusement. "I see why he found the letter interesting," Finch said. Margaret looked at her book. "I don't say that to be impertinent," he said, with a shift in tone that she filed away, quieter, slightly less polished, the register of someone saying something they actually mean rather than something they have prepared. "I say it because I have known Edward Wentworth for 15 years, and I have not in 15 years seen him carry a letter around for 3 weeks. Margaret said nothing. "He doesn't keep things," Finch said. It's a thing about him. He processes and moves on. Correspondence answered and filed. Problems resolved and closed. He is extraordinarily efficient about everything." A pause. "He carried your letter for 3 weeks. That is, for Edward, that is," he seemed to be searching for the right word. "That is the equivalent of another man doing something very dramatic indeed." Margaret looked at him. She thought, "This is information." She thought, "I am not certain I trust the source." She thought, "Both of these things can be true simultaneously." "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Finch looked at her for a moment. The easy social face had settled into something slightly more genuine, not entirely, perhaps not capable of entirely, but more. "Because," he said, "I made a mess of something that didn't need to be a mess, and I would like to not unmake it because I can't, but perhaps not make it worse." He paused. "And because I genuinely think you are formidable, Miss Hale. And I find formidable women interesting, which I am aware is not a particularly useful thing to say, but there it is." Margaret held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "The letter before you read it, did you read all of it?" A pause. "No," he said. "Edward stopped me at a certain point, took it back." He looked at her steadily. "He didn't read the last paragraph, I want you to know that. Whatever he did, and I know what he did, I was there, I was part of it." He stopped before the end. I saw his face when he stopped. He paused. "I don't know what's in the last paragraph, I don't want to know, but I think you should know that he stopped." Margaret looked at her hands. She already knew this. She had known it, had suspected it, and confirmed it against the text of what she had heard and what she remembered writing since the Tuesday itself. She had known it and had not known what to do with the knowing because it complicated the clean lines of what had happened in a way she was not yet ready to deal with. She was not ready to deal with it now either, but she said, "Thank you," and she meant it, partially. Enough. Finch rose. He gave her a nod, genuine, without the social gloss, and left. Margaret looked at her book. She did not read. She thought about what he had said. He doesn't keep things. She thought about 3 weeks of silence and a letter in a coat pocket and a man who had read most of it aloud and stopped before the end, which was what exactly? Not redemption, not absolution, but something. Some line he had drawn, something he had held back, some last piece of her that he had decided, in whatever remained of his judgment in that moment, was not for the room. She was not going to make too much of this. She was also not, she acknowledged, going to make nothing of it. She thought about Mrs. Avery's question, "What do you want to happen?" She thought, "I want what I wanted before any of this. I want the conversations at Lady Pemberton's and the arguments about ideas and the specific quality of being listened to by someone who is genuinely listening. I want," she stopped, "I want not to have to be careful all the time. I want one person in this city who asks what I think because he wants to know the answer." She thought, "I want something I am not at all certain is safe to want." She picked up her book. She read one page and then she looked up. He was in his chair across the room. He had arrived while Finch was talking. She had registered it peripherally, had not looked. He was looking at her now with the direct, unmanaged attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he was, underneath the composed surface, when he stopped performing and started actually being present. He did not look away. She did not look away. 10 seconds, perhaps 15. An accountable quantity of time in which two people looked at each other across a room and neither of them performed anything. Then Margaret looked back at her book. But she was almost, not quite, not ready to admit entirely, almost smiling. He saw Finch leave. He had watched the conversation from across the room with the particular alertness of a man who has no right to interfere and is aware of it, and is interfering only in the most passive and involuntary way, which is to say, watching, without moving, without approaching, with his hands folded on his book and his attention entirely elsewhere. He had not been able to read a word since Finch sat down beside her. He watched her face, at this distance, without being able to hear the conversation. Her face was the only text available to him, and he read it with the close attention he gave to things that mattered. He watched her register Finch. He watched her listen. He watched the small, precise adjustments, not defensiveness, not warmth exactly, something more considered than either, the expression of a woman sorting information as it arrives and making real-time decisions about what to do with it. He watched her ask something, one sentence direct, her chin slightly lifted. He watched Finch answer. He watched what the answer did to her face, a stilling, a looking inward that lasted a second and then resolved, and then she said something else and Finch nodded and left. And then she had looked at her book, and then she had looked up, and they had looked at each other for whatever span of time that was. He had not counted it, had not been capable of counting anything at that moment, and he had held her gaze and she had held his, and then she had looked away. But not before he saw, at the very corner of her mouth, the beginning of something. He was not going to assign significance to the beginning of something at the corner of a mouth. He was going to sit in his chair and read his book and wait, as he had committed to waiting, and not reconstruct a near smile into more than a near smile. He read his book. He retained nothing. On the 3rd Wednesday of November, Lord Cavendish was in the reading room. This was unusual. Cavendish preferred the main room, the fire was better, he said, and the chairs were older, and old chairs had learned the shape of him. He appeared in the reading room occasionally, when the mood took him, and settled into whichever chair was nearest with the indifference of a man who has long since stopped accommodating himself to furniture and has decided furniture must accommodate itself to him. He settled today near the window, 3 chairs from Margaret. Edward watched him do this from across the room. Cavendish opened his newspaper. He read, Margaret read. Edward did not read. The room continued its afternoon. After 20 minutes, without looking up from his paper, Cavendish said, Miss Hale. Margaret looked over. Cavendish, he said, we have not been formally introduced, which is a failure of protocol I am too old to feel guilty about. You are Lord Ashton's cousin. Distant cousin, Margaret said. Yes. Cavendish lowered his paper slightly. He looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a man who has been looking at people for 73 years and stopped pretending he was doing anything else. You wrote a letter about ideas. A pause. I have written several, Margaret said carefully. One in particular, Cavendish said, which I understand was well written and well argued and handled very badly by someone who should have known better. He paused. I told him so. I want you to know that. Not because it changes anything, simply because someone should have said it to his face, and I am one of the few people in this building still willing to say things to people's faces. Margaret looked at him. You sat down, Cavendish said, on Tuesday instead of leaving. Yes. Why? She considered him for a moment. Then she said, because leaving looked like running, and I have never run from anything if I had a reasonable alternative. Cavendish looked at her for a long, steady moment. He said. He returned to his newspaper. But 2 minutes later, without looking up, he said, You come here on Wednesdays. Yes. So does he. A pause, the paper turned. I have noticed that you read and he fails to read, and neither of you speaks to the other, which is either very principled or very wasteful, depending on how much time you think you have. He turned another page. I am 73. I find the question of time considerably more pressing than I did at your ages. Take from that what you will. He read his newspaper. Margaret looked at her book. Edward, across the room, stared at the page he had not turned in 11 minutes. The fire burned. The rain came steadily against the windows. The reading room held them all in its particular afternoon quiet, 3 people and their respective silences, each one saying, in its own way, something the words hadn't yet arrived for. She was leaving coat on, book in her bag, gloves in her hand, when she found him in the corridor. Not deliberately. He was coming from the direction of the main room. She was going toward the stairs, and the corridor was narrow enough that not finding him would have required one of them to have taken a different route, which neither of them had. They stopped. 3 feet between them, the corridor quiet around them, the sounds of the club muffled through the walls, distant, belonging to somewhere else. Margaret put on her gloves. He watched her do this, the small practical task of buttoning each glove at the wrist, and then he said, very quietly, How is the book? She looked up. Which book? She said. Whichever one you've been reading these past 3 Wednesdays. I have not been able to determine the title from across the room. She looked at him for a moment. It's a collection of essays, she said, on the philosophy of language, whether words precede ideas or follow them. And I think the author is wrong about the central premise but right about most of the evidence, which is a frustrating combination. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. That does sound frustrating. It is. She adjusted her second glove. He would have benefited from someone arguing with him before he published. Most people would. Yes, she said, though most people don't know that about themselves. A pause. The kind of pause that has weight, not uncomfortable, not exactly, but aware of itself, aware of what it is standing in the middle of. Margaret, he said. She looked at him. I know you asked for time, he said. I am not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I simply wanted to. He stopped. Started again in the way she had come to recognize as him discarding the prepared version and reaching for the real one. I miss talking to you, he said. I am aware I have not earned the right to say that, but it is true, and I thought it was better to say a true thing than to manage the conversation into something more comfortable. The corridor. The rain outside somewhere. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, the real looking, the unhurried kind. She thought about Cavendish. How much time do you think you have? She thought about Mrs. Avery. What do you want to happen? She thought about a letter written at 2 in the morning and sent on a rainy Thursday and carried in someone's coat pocket for 3 weeks, which was careless and wrong, and also, she was beginning to understand, not nothing. She thought about the last paragraph, about the words she had written and he had not read aloud, about the line he had drawn in the middle of his own failure without anyone asking him to. She said, I have been thinking about what you said in your letter, about not knowing what to do with something and handling not knowing by doing nothing. He was very still. I do that too, she said. Not with letters, with decisions, with things I'm not ready for. I make myself very busy with other things and I tell myself I am thinking, but I am mostly just waiting for the thing to resolve itself without requiring anything of me. She paused. It never does, of course, resolve itself, but the waiting feels safer than the alternative. Yes, he said, that is exactly what it feels like. They looked at each other. I am still angry, she said. I want to be honest about that. I am not, this is not me saying I am not angry. I know. But I am also, she stopped, looked at her gloves, looked back up. I am tired of not talking, she said. That is the most I can offer you at the present moment. I am tired of not talking and I think carefully, and not yet in the reading room where people watch, I think I might be willing to try again. Talking. He looked at her with the expression she had finally, after months of watching, learned to read correctly. The one that was not the Duke of Ashford expression, not the public face, but the one underneath, the one that appeared when he had stopped performing and started simply being, which was the face of a man who felt things considerably more than he let anyone see and was, very slowly and with great difficulty, beginning to let one person see. I would like that, he said, very much. Good, she said. She moved toward the stairs, then she stopped. Without turning, the essay collection, it is by a Professor Caldwell if you wanted to read it, so you have something to argue with me about. A pause behind her. Then, very quietly, as if the words had surprised him on the way out. I already have something to argue with you about. She almost smiled. She went down the stairs. Outside, the November rain was cold and steady, and entirely indifferent to the fact that something had shifted, quietly, carefully, with the specific quality of a window opened in a room that had been closed for a very long time. Margaret walked home through it. She did not mind the rain. He found the Caldwell essays on Friday morning. Not without effort. The book was not at his usual bookseller, who apologized with the practiced regret of a man accustomed to apologizing for the unavailability of academic texts that most of his clientele had no interest in purchasing. Edward tried 2 more shops before finding it at a small, cramped place on a side street near Holborn that smelled of damp paper and ambition, and had the particular atmosphere of a bookshop that had never quite decided whether it was a library or a shop, and had settled comfortably on being both. The proprietor knew the book immediately. Caldwell, yes, difficult man, interesting thinker, wrong about the central premise, he said, pulling it from a shelf without needing to look, which told Edward this was a book that people asked for rather than stumbled upon. So I've heard, Edward said. He read it that evening. All of it not in the efficient, scanning way he read parliamentary documents and correspondence, but properly, slowly, the way he had once read things before his life had filled up with things that required faster reading. He sat by the fire in his study with a glass he forgot to drink and turned pages with the focused attention of a man who is genuinely interested and is also, underneath the interest, preparing. Caldwell was wrong about the central premise. He was right about most of the evidence. It was a deeply frustrating combination. He found himself, at several points, forming arguments he wanted to say aloud, reaching the end of a paragraph and having an immediate response, and then having no one to give it to, which was a sensation he recognized from Lady Pemberton's literary afternoon, and from 6 months of conversations that had felt like the beginning of something and then stopped. He had become accustomed, over those 6 months, to having someone to give his arguments to. He had not realized until it stopped how accustomed he had become. He finished the book at midnight. He sat for a while with it closed in his lap. He thought about what she had said in the corridor. "I am tired of not talking." The particular honesty of it, not forgiveness. She had been precise about that. Not yet and perhaps not for some time, but a willingness to begin again at something, carefully, which was more than he had expected and more than he had perhaps earned. He thought about "I already have something to argue with you about." He had not planned to say that. It had arrived before he decided to say it, the same way the best things he said arrived, without preparation, pulled out of him by the specific quality of her attention, which was the most demanding and the most clarifying attention he had ever been subject to. She listened the way serious readers read, expecting the text to yield something real, prepared to be disappointed, genuinely pleased when it didn't. He had spent 36 years in rooms where people listened to him with the specific quality of people waiting to respond. She listened with the quality of someone actually taking things in. He put the book on his desk. He was going to see her on Wednesday. He was going to, for the first time in almost a month, actually talk to her. He realized, sitting in his study at midnight with a book in his lap, more nervous than he had been before any parliamentary vote, any estate negotiation, any conversation with any person of any significance in his adult life. He found this clarifying in its way. Wednesday arrived with the particular quality of days that have been anticipated too long, slightly unreal, slightly overlit, the morning taking forever and the afternoon arriving too fast. He was at the club at 2. She arrived at past, as she always did. He watched her come through the door, coat, book, gloves, the self-contained efficiency of her movement that he had catalogued without meaning to over months of watching her enter rooms. She gave her coat to the attendant. She looked around the room, taking inventory, as she always did, the quick cataloging scan, and found him. She did not look away. Neither did he. She came to the sitting area near the window, not her usual chair by the wall, which was further from him. The chair across from his. She sat. "You found the book," she said, looking at it on the table beside him. "Friday morning, a shop near Holborn." "Stubbs," she said. "He ordered it for me 2 months ago. He seemed to feel personally vindicated when I confirmed it was worth reading. He told me it was wrong about the central premise." "He's right." She settled her own book in her lap. She had brought it, but he suspected, with the specific attention he had developed for her habits, that she would not open it today. "What did you think?" "I think Caldwell has made a fundamental error in his 3rd chapter that undermines everything that follows, but that the undermined everything is still considerably more interesting than most things that haven't been undermined." She looked at him with the expression, the real one, the one that didn't perform. "Which error?" He conflates the evolution of language with the function of language. They're separate questions, and he treats them as the same question, which means by chapter 5 he's answering a question he hasn't asked yet and ignoring the one he has. A pause. "That is exactly the error," she said, "and exactly why it's frustrating. Because if you separate the questions the way they should be separated, his evidence actually supports a much more interesting argument than the one he makes. Which is, that language doesn't follow ideas or precede them," she said. It runs alongside, a parallel track, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, occasionally in the same place at the same moment, which is when you get the sensation of having said exactly what you meant, which is rare enough that people remember it. Edward looked at her. "That's better than his argument," he said. "I know," she said without vanity, simply as a fact. "I wrote to tell him so." He stared at her. "You wrote to Caldwell." He published his address in the preface. It seemed like an invitation. She looked slightly defensive, which was one of the few expressions he had seen on her that involved any uncertainty at all. I realized that was perhaps. "What did he say?" A pause, then he wrote back. "We have been corresponding for 6 weeks. He is revising the 3rd chapter." Edward looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You wrote to a professor of philosophy to tell him his central premise was wrong, and he is revising his work based on your correspondence." The argument was sound. "Margaret," he said her name the way it had been arriving lately, without the weight of proof, just the word, just her. "You are remarkable." She looked at him. Not the composure face, not the assembled expression. Something more open than that, slightly surprised, slightly careful, the expression of someone who has been handed something and is deciding whether it is safe to hold. "You said," she said after a moment, "in the corridor that you had something to argue with me about." "Yes." "That wasn't about Caldwell." "No," he said, "it wasn't." She waited. He had thought about how to say this. He had thought about it on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, had constructed and dismantled several versions, had tried to find the architecture of it, the right sequence, the words in the right order. He had failed each time to find a version that felt honest rather than constructed, and he had concluded, finally, that this was because honest things resisted construction. They arrived or they didn't. He let it arrive. "I want to explain something," he said. "Not to excuse what I did. I want to be clear that this is not, I am not looking for your absolution. I simply think that there is a part of what happened that I have not yet said clearly, and I think you deserve clarity." She was very still. "When your letter arrived at the estate," he said, "I read it twice before I put it down. Twice, standing at my desk, which is not how I read anything. And the reason I didn't write back, the real reason, not the excuse about being busy or needing time, is that your letter required a response that was honest. And an honest response would have required me to say things that I was not ready to say. About what the letter meant to me. About what," he stopped. "About what you had become to me. Over 6 months of conversations in rooms neither of us were entirely supposed to be having conversations in. The fire. The rain outside. The room very quiet. I was afraid," he said. "That is the plain fact of it. I was afraid, and I handled fear by carrying the letter around and doing nothing with it, which is what I do with things that matter enough to frighten me, as I told you in my letter, and which I have been doing my entire life with varying degrees of consequence." He held her gaze. "What I did at the club was wrong. I have said that, and I mean it, and I will not qualify it. But the thing underneath the wrong thing, the thing that made the wrong thing happen, was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference." Margaret looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. In the way she looked at things she was reading, taking it in, following it, deciding what she thought. "You could have told me that," she said finally. "Any of it at any point." "I know." "A response to my letter, 1 sentence. Even," she paused, "even not a good sentence, even an honest sentence that was clumsy or incomplete, that would have been enough." "I know," he said again. "I am better at understanding things than I am at saying them in time. I am working on the gap." She looked at him. "Working on it," she said, not dismissive, testing the phrase, turning it over. "It is a large gap," he said. "It will take time, but I am working on it with more genuine effort than I have applied to it before." He paused. "You are, it turns out, very motivating." Something moved across her face. The near smile, he was beginning to catalog its variations. This near smile, the different things it meant in different moments. This one meant something he was not quite ready to name, but that sat warmly in his chest regardless. The last paragraph, she said. He went still. Of my letter, she said. You stopped before it. Yes. Why? He looked at her. Because it was yours. Because it was the part that was specifically for me and I could not, he stopped. Found the honest version. Because reading it aloud would have been a different kind of betrayal than reading the rest. The rest was ideas, arguments. The last paragraph was what? She said quietly. He held her gaze. Was the most honest thing anyone had written to me in 36 years, he said. And I knew it when I read it, and I could not make it into entertainment. I could not. He paused. I did not read it aloud. Finch did not see it. Whatever I failed to protect of yours that day, and I failed to protect a great deal, I protected that. The room was very quiet. Margaret looked at her hands, then at the window, then back at him. I want to ask you something, she said. And I want you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically, not carefully, just honestly. Yes, he said. The last paragraph, she said. I would like you to read it now, aloud. She reached into her bag the book and tucked inside the book's front cover a folded piece of paper that she set on the table between them. To me, here, just to me. He looked at the paper. He looked at her. You kept a copy, he said. I always keep copies of things that matter, she said simply, in case they are lost. He thought about this, about a woman who had learned, through some education he could only guess at, to keep copies of the things that mattered in case they were lost. He thought about what it meant that she had brought it today, that she had decided between Wednesday and Wednesday to bring it. He reached for the paper. His hands, he noted, were not entirely steady. He unfolded it. He found the last paragraph, shorter than the rest, sitting at the bottom of the page like something she had nearly cut, the handwriting slightly different, slightly more deliberate, the way handwriting becomes when the writer is choosing each word carefully. He read it. Not silently, aloud. Quietly, just for her, just for this room, just for the afternoon. I am not certain I should include this, and I have rewritten it 3 times, and I am including it anyway because I have decided that the alternative, which is to be careful and say nothing and pretend I have not been thinking it, is a worse choice, even if this is also a bad choice. I think you are the only person I have encountered in a very long time who makes me want to think harder. Not to perform thinking, not to demonstrate thinking, but to actually do the work of it more carefully and more honestly than I would alone. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not even certain I am supposed to tell you, but it seemed, given the nature of this letter, dishonest to leave it out. He finished. He folded the paper, the clock on the wall, the rain on the windows, the fire. He looked up. She was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her before, open in a way she usually wasn't, the composure still there but thinner, like ice in early spring, present but changed. I should have written back, he said. The day I read it, I should have written back immediately and told you. He stopped. That I felt the same, that I had felt it since Lady Pemberton, since instructive, since a dozen conversations in rooms where neither of us was entirely supposed to be talking to the other. That whatever it is that makes you want to think harder, I felt it too. I feel it, he held her gaze. I feel it very much, still, regardless of everything. The room held the words. Margaret looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. Then she said, You could have said that in a letter. I could have. 3 weeks ago. Yes. Instead you carried it around and said nothing, and then read the other parts to Finch. Yes, he said, and the word landed exactly as it always landed, flat and unmitigated, because he was not going to cushion it. A pause. You are, Margaret said very carefully, an extraordinarily frustrating person. I know. You are also, she stopped, looked at her hands, made a decision he could see her making, the small shift of someone choosing honesty over protection. You are the only person in this city who argues with me because he wants to know if he's wrong, she said, Not to win, not to impress, because he actually wants to know, and that is, she paused. That is not a small thing to me. I want you to understand that it is not a small thing. He was quiet for a moment. It is not a small thing to me either, he said. What you are, what talking to you is. He held her gaze. I am sorry it took me so long to say it in a room rather than a pocket. She almost laughed, not quite, but almost, the near laugh that was the cousin of the near smile, the sound that arrived before she caught it. In a pocket, she said. It is where the letter lived for 3 weeks. I thought it deserved an acknowledgement. This time she did laugh, brief, small, real. The surprised kind startled out of her that he had catalogued as the most honest sound she made. It changed the room. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony. Simply, the thing that had been sitting between them for a month, the careful distance, the Wednesday silences, it shifted. Didn't disappear. Wouldn't disappear entirely for some time yet, he suspected, because she was not a woman who forgot things or pretended they hadn't happened, and he would not want her to be. But it shifted, made room for something else to coexist with it. Professor Caldwell, she said, after a moment, returning to the surface of things in the way that people return to the surface, when something underwater has been acknowledged and doesn't need to be dwelt on yet. Yes, he said, following her there, grateful for it. His 3rd chapter. I think if you read my letters to him, I have copies, you will see where the revision needs to go. But I suspect you will disagree with my 3rd point. Why? Because my 3rd point requires accepting that language can mean something the speaker didn't intend, and you have always seemed to me like someone who believes intention is primary. He looked at her. I have been reconsidering, he said, the primacy of intention. She held his gaze. Good, she said, so have I. Outside, November went about its business. The rain continued, as it would continue for weeks, steady, gray, indifferent, the long London rain that doesn't hurry because it has nowhere to be. Inside the reading room, 2 people talked. Not carefully, not with the managed distance of the previous Wednesdays. Actually talked, argued about Caldwell, disputed the 3rd point, found unexpected agreement on the 5th, disagreed about the conclusion with the specific energy of 2 people who are enjoying the disagreement more than they would enjoy agreement, who have found in each other the rare thing of a mind that makes the work of thinking feel less like work. They talked until the light changed and the room emptied and the attendant came quietly to tend the fire and gave them the specific look of a man who has been tending fires in this room for 15 years and knows what the room looks like when it is doing something important. Then Margaret gathered her book. She stood. She put on her coat. He stood with her. At the door she stopped. Edward, she said. He looked at her. She had not used his name before, not ever. Not in any of it. He felt it land with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to one word, and entirely appropriate to this particular word in this particular voice. Yes, he said. Next Wednesday, she said, not a question. Next Wednesday, he said. She nodded once, she left. He stood in the doorway of the reading room for a moment, in the club that bore his family's name, in the city he had lived in for 36 years, and thought that the room looked different than it had an hour ago. It was the same room. He was not the same man. He went home through the November rain and sat at his desk, and for the first time in 36 years, wrote a letter that said exactly what he meant on the first attempt, without revision, without postponement, without putting it in his pocket. He sent it before he slept. Margaret's perspective, the letter arrived on Thursday morning, not from Edward. This one was from Finch. She knew before she opened it that it was not good news. Finch did not write social letters. His writing to her meant he had information he had decided she should have. She opened it, she read it once, she sat very still, then she read it again, 3 facts. The first, in the weeks following the Tuesday, Finch had told people a version of events that was not false but shaped. The word he had used was presumptuous. A presumptuous woman who had written an unsolicited letter to a duke and then performed wounded dignity when it was received with appropriate skepticism. Not a victim, a social climber who had overreached. He had said this to 5 people. He named them. The second, he was telling her because he had reconsidered. Not from virtue, she would not believe that, and he wasn't going to insult her intelligence by claiming it. But because he had watched her over 3 Wednesdays and understood he had misjudged her. The third, 2 of the 5 people he had told were Lady Harcastle and Mrs. Dorset, which meant the version of Margaret Hale as presumptuous overreacher was, by now, in enough drawing rooms to have become a texture in the air. Not a scandal, something quieter and more corrosive than scandal, a consensus. She put the letter down. She stood at the window and looked at the London street below and let herself understand the shape of it. She was not surprised. She had known, somewhere underneath everything else, that the Tuesday was not finished. She had simply been too absorbed in Wednesdays to look for the ripple she hadn't yet seen. She thought about the 5 names. She thought about what presumptuous meant, spreading quietly through the rooms she moved in, a fractional lowering of warmth in greetings, a slight adjustment in how her name landed. She thought about Lord Ashton, who had been kind and did not deserve complications. She thought about Edward. The story Finch had seeded was not designed to ruin her. It was designed to make Edward look foolish for finding her interesting, to reframe his attention as credulity rather than judgment. And it had been set in motion before the Wednesdays, before the corridor, before any of it, already moving while they were carefully, slowly beginning. She sat back down. She picked up her pen. She wrote to Finch, "Thank you for telling me. I will not pretend I am not angry at what you did then and at the fact that you are telling me now rather than sooner, but I appreciate the honesty. I would like to meet. M.H." She wrote to Mrs. Avery, "Something has happened. I am not undone, but I need someone to think alongside. Write quickly. Your Margaret." She did not write to Edward. Not yet. She needed to understand more before she knew what to tell him. And she needed, this was harder to admit, to handle some portion of this herself. Not because she didn't trust him. Because she was Margaret Hale, and she had been handling things herself long enough that the habit was structural, and there was a part of her that needed to know she could do this alone before she decided what it meant to do things together. She put on her coat, she went out, she had people to see. He heard on Friday. From Bertram, who heard from his mother, who had been at Lady Harcastle's Thursday afternoon and registered something wrong in how Margaret's name landed. Bertram came to Edward's house. He told him everything he had. Edward listened without interrupting. When Bertram finished, the room was quiet. "Finch," Edward said. "Almost certainly. The word presumptuous is chosen. Someone put it in the right mouths deliberately." Edward sat very still. He thought about Margaret, about her words in someone else's voice, and then the chair, and then the Wednesdays, and then the corridor, and then yesterday, sitting across from him and talking about Caldwell, and underneath all of it this, moving through her rooms while they were carefully beginning. He felt a cold, clean anger. "Where is Finch?" he said. "Edward," Bertram looked at him carefully. "She is the one this happened to. The question is what she wants to do about it, not what you want to do about Finch." Edward was quiet. He thought about everything he knew about Margaret Hale. The chair, Caldwell. "I have never run from anything if I had a reasonable alternative." "She already knows," he said. Bertram looked at him. "How?" "Because she watches rooms more carefully than anyone I have ever met, and Finch has been moving toward telling her since the reading room." He paused. "She's deciding what to do." "And you?" "I'm going to wait," Edward said, "until she tells me what she needs, and then I'm going to do exactly that, nothing more, nothing less." Bertram stared at him. "That is entirely out of character." "I know," Edward said. "I'm working on the gap." She met Finch at a coffee house near the Strand on Saturday. He was there before her, looking like a man who hadn't slept, which she felt was appropriate. He told her everything. 20 minutes, no interruptions, 3 precise questions from her that he answered directly. When he finished, she sat with it. "Why did you do it?" she said, "originally?" He looked at his coffee. "Because I have watched women understand something real about Wentworth and write it down and give it to him for 15 years. And he carries it around and does nothing, and they are hurt, and he is unchanged. I decided I was doing him a favor by removing the possibility before it became painful." He paused. "I was wrong. I underestimated you, and I underestimated what you did to him, and I made a decision that wasn't mine to make." "He is not unchanged," Margaret said. It came out more certain than she expected. "No," Finch agreed, "he is not." She looked at the street outside. She thought about what she had and didn't have. Lord Ashton, decent and embarrassed. Cavendish, 73 years of rooms and the specific gravity that came with them. Mrs. Alcott, kind and well-connected, her own mind. And Edward, not as a weapon or a shield, but as someone who would do what she asked and nothing more and nothing less. She looked back at Finch. "I need you to do something." "Yes," he said without asking what. "Go back to the 5 people. Don't retract. Retracting creates its own story. Add to it. Contextualize. You told them I was presumptuous. Now tell them you reconsidered the word. That what you observed was not presumption but precision. That Miss Hale wrote a precise letter about a precise topic to a man she had precise conversations with, and that the failure was not the letters but the readers." Finch looked at her. "You want me to correct the record without it looking like a correction?" "I want you to tell the truth," she said. "A fuller version of it, which you should have done from the beginning." "And Wentworth?" "I will speak to him, in my own time." "He knows," Finch said. "Bertram Alcott's mother was at Harcastle's." "I know," Margaret said. "He will wait." Finch looked at her steadily. "You sound very certain of that." "I am," she said, and she was. She went to Cavendish on Monday. He received her in his library and did not offer tea immediately, which she respected. He looked at the Caldwell book she'd brought. He looked at her. "Tell me what happened," he said. "From the beginning, just the facts." She told him. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He named the 2 women who mattered, correctly without being told. "Lady Harcastle doesn't update assessments on the basis of new information," he said. "She updates them on the basis of what she sees. You cannot tell her something and have her believe it. You have to show her something and let her conclude it herself." "I know," Margaret said. "I am hosting a dinner in 3 weeks. I would like you to attend as my guest. Not Ashton's. Mine." He looked at her. "The people there will want to understand why you are there. You will answer them as you answer questions. And Wentworth will be there because he always comes to my dinners, and whatever he does in that room will be its own answer." "You are being very kind," she said. "I am being extremely self-interested. I find most people in this city insufferably dull." He picked up the Caldwell book. "I will have notes." "I look forward to arguing with them," she said. "Good," he said. "So do I." She went home. She sat at her desk. She wrote to Edward. "Dear Edward, I know that you know. I know you have been waiting since Friday, and I appreciate it more than I have words for, which is saying something. I have been managing something this week, and I am nearly finished. There are things I want to tell you in person, not in the reading room. Somewhere neither of us is performing anything. If you know somewhere like that, will you tell me?" She posted it herself. She did not wait 3 weeks for the answer. The letter arrived Tuesday morning. He read it once standing. Then he sat down, which was not how he processed correspondence. He picked up his pen. He wrote 7 words, "The Park. Wednesday at 3, I'll be there." Then, after a moment, 3 more, "Thank you for writing." He sent it before he could reconsider the phrasing. "The Park. Wednesday at 3. Nearly empty. Bare trees, white sky, cold air. Margaret arrived first and found a bench sheltered from the wind. She sat. She was wearing her warmest coat and her mother's scarf, which she wore on days when she needed something old and warm and hers. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. He came around the hedge line and stopped when he saw her, not surprised, more the quality of someone who has been moving toward a thing and has now arrived. He came to the bench. He sat beside her. "How are you?" he said. "Better," she said, "than last week." They sat for a moment. A pigeon investigated something on the path. "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. "I want to say something clearly," he said, "without building to it, because I have spent enough time building to things." He held her gaze. "I am in love with you. I have been since Lady Pemberton, since instructive, since a dozen conversations in rooms where neither of us was supposed to be having them. I handled it very badly, and I am sorry for how badly I handled it." He paused. "I am not telling you to create an obligation. I am telling you because it is true and you have asked me to say true things clearly. The park, the white sky, the bare trees." Margaret looked at him, the long, unhurried looking. She thought about a letter carried for 3 weeks in a coat pocket. She thought about 40 minutes in a chair. She thought about Cavendish and how much time do you think you have and Mrs. Avery and what do you want to happen. She said, "I know." He looked at her. "I have known for some time," she said. "Not the word, I didn't have the word, but the thing underneath it." She paused. "I am going to be honest with you. The anger is still there, smaller than it was, but there. I think you should know that, and I think we should not pretend otherwise." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "But," she said. He went very still. "I am getting there," she said. "That is the most accurate thing I can tell you. I am moving toward it, and I want to keep moving toward it with you present, not managing the timeline, just be present." He looked at her for a long moment. "I can do that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "You've been practicing." Something moved in his face, relief, and something warmer than relief, and underneath both a steady gladness that was not triumphant but simply there. After a while he said, "Tell me about Cavendish's dinner." She told him. He listened with the real listening. He asked the right questions. After a while she said, "Your argument about the single traveler, I've been thinking about it. And I think the incompleteness is in assuming the traveler is one person," she said, working it out as she spoke. "What if the translation works better with two? What if that's what language is actually for, not one person moving between their idea and their word, but two people building the translation together? Which is why it fails so often alone and works, occasionally, between the right people." He was quiet. "That," he said, "is better than Caldwell's argument." "I know. And better than mine." "Yes, though yours is what made it possible." He looked at her. She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. They stayed until the cold became insistent, and then they walked not anywhere particular, just the paths, and talked about Caldwell and Cavendish and a village in Wiltshire and what it smelled like in winter, and about a park in Derbyshire near the Wentworth estate that was, he said, worth seeing in spring. In spring, he said. As a fact. She did not correct him. The reading room on a Tuesday afternoon in September. Warm light through the tall windows. The Caldwell essays on the table beside her chair, covered in margin notes in 2 different handwritings. A complete record of a disagreement conducted over 7 months that had arrived, eventually, not at a resolution but at something more interesting. A third argument neither of them had started with, built from the parts of both. Cavendish had told them to publish it. The paper was being drafted. At 2:30 the door opened. She didn't look up, but she registered it, the footstep she had catalogued so long ago she sometimes thought she could identify it through walls. He came to her. He sat. He was holding a letter. "What is it?" she said. He held it out. It was from Caldwell. She read it. "Read it again." "He wants to include our correspondence in the revision," she said. "As an appendix, both names." She looked at the letter for a moment. She thought about a woman who had written to a professor because his address was in the preface, and the argument was wrong, and how different the same room could look depending on which chair you sat in. "Yes," she said, "both names, the whole record. It is a better argument than either of us started with. It should have both names on it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Cavendish is going to be insufferable. Cavendish is always insufferable about being right. It is his primary characteristic and his primary charm. She stood. We should go and tell him in person. He stood with her. Edward, she said. Yes. Thank you for the park, for the waiting. She paused. For the letter you sent the same day. You didn't need any of it, he said. I know, she said. That's not why I'm thanking you. He understood. She could see it simply arriving in his face and staying. She picked up the Caldwell book with its two-handed margin notes. She looked at it for a moment. All those months of argument in the margins, the disagreements and revisions, and the third thing that had grown in the space between their handwritings. Come on then, she said. They walked out through the entrance hall and into the September afternoon, which was warm and bright and entirely indifferent to the fact that two people had just walked through a door they had worked very hard to arrive at. 6 months later, the revised Caldwell essays were published with a 40-page appendix, a correspondence on parallel tracks, 2 authors listed. The book went through 3 printings. Professor Caldwell wrote to say the appendix was more interesting than the book. He was not wrong. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.